Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to our second installment of Goats 101. I'm going to go ahead and throw up our presentation real quick. So this presentation is going to be divided among Caitlin, Wally, Stoll, and myself pretty evenly tonight. I am going to, let me see if that shared properly. It did not. Let me try again. It's always an adventure.
Right now we're seeing like the
Yep.
PowerPoint.
Can you throw it up here?
Yep.
Play.
And
Wrong
now
one.
we're seeing, yep, you're good.
And
there
there
go.
we are. So welcome. Thank you again for joining us. Just a quick overview for those of you who haven't joined us already. My name is Amy Barkley. I'm the Livestock and Beginning Farm Specialist with the Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops Program. Our program is a partnership between the 5 county associations in Southwestern New York and Cornell University. While we do most of our programming in Southwest New York, sometimes we have the opportunity to provide programming across the state like this program tonight. So thank you for joining us. This is our team for those of you who are in Southwest New York and are looking for some specialists in production agriculture. We have Caitlin Wally Stoll, who I'll let you introduce herself in a moment here. Myself, our forage and field crop specialist, Caitlin Miller, and our dairy production specialist, Camila Lodge. So I am going to let Caitlin introduce herself first.
Hi, everybody. As Amy mentioned, I'm our team's team leader and farm business management specialist. So I primarily work with farms on paperwork, people, and profit. So the business part that none of you are into farming for, right? I've been in extension for about 10 years. I also have a livestock farm that my husband and I operate. We both grew up on dairy farms and decided we didn't want to milk cows. So we raise beef and assorted other goods. And one of those goods are goats. We raise primarily boar meat goats and have been doing that for about 12 years now. So here tonight, part my cooperative extension role and part my lived farm experience role.
Yep.
Thanks,
And
Amy.
Caitlin's farm experience role is really critical tonight because she is going to do most of the hoof trimming demonstration videos for us a little later on in the second half of our presentation. So thank you, Caitlin, for helping us get those goats to video and for having such nice goats to video, because sometimes it's really tricky to get good videos of goats when they want to do their own thing, which is all of the time. I am Amy Barkley, Livestock and Beginning Farm Specialist. That cut off my email address a little bit, but if you need it, I can go ahead and type it in the chat. I work with folks who are just starting out in farming with the intention of earning a profit. And I also work with livestock production. So anything in regards to production and management, meat quality and consistency, grazing management, that sort of thing. I have a small diversified farming operation that my husband and I operate in East Concord, New York. We don't do goats. We elected out of goats after having had exposure enough to goat experience to realize that was not for us, and that is okay. But we do love goats dearly. We do have an apiary, we have an orchard, we have a market garden, and we raise heritage poultry as our primary crop here. I should go back a second. If you have any issues with technology tonight, which we all know technology can be a bear sometimes, please feel free to text either Caitlin or myself, depending on who's not presenting, and we will go ahead and help you get back on or get connected or get your audio working, whatever you may have trouble with. We also want to take a moment to thank the Cornell Small Farms Farm Ops program tonight for their support in designing the series. They have provided us not only the raw support to do this, which has been wonderful, but they've also provided some financial support, which has allowed us to get some videography equipment to get the awesome videos that we have to share with you. And as a quick disclaimer, if you've seen this before, you know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that we are education professionals. We take information and present the most up-to-date, best to our knowledge, scientific-based information. But if you have anything very specific that you'd like answered, we recommend finding a professional. In this case, it's mostly going to be in regards to veterinary care. So what we're providing you is a baseline and reference, but we request that you go to a veterinary professional for further information on specific disease. And with that, let's start. Goat, herd, and foot health. Goodness gracious, I don't know why I said GERD. But anyway, these adorable little goats will show up in some videos later. So tonight we're going to talk about managing for health as a whole, because managing for health is a whole environmental system. It's not just working with the goat, the pathogen, or the environment, it's a combination. We're also going to talk through some common goat diseases, and then some of the more infectious, scary goat diseases that aren't so common, but are good to look out for. So we'll have a break then, and then following the break, we'll talk about hoof health and go through a hoof trimming demonstration. So first, I'm going to launch a poll, and my question to you all is, tell us who you are. There's already a goat in my garage. Pretty close to raising goats, not there yet. I want some more information before I commit, or I am in the wrong webinar. And then if you scroll down a little bit more, we're asking, did you join us last night? Yes or no? We'll give that another 5 or so seconds here. Okay, so it looks like we've got a little bit of a mix, which is wonderful. So thank you all for joining us. And we have a good amount of folks that have joined us before, but some that are new. So if you're new, welcome. So let's get into managing for health. As I shared before, goat disease triad is typically the host, which is the goat, a pathogen, which is something that causes disease, and the environment. So how we manage that environment will impact how pathogens affect the host. I am a strong believer that a lot of what affects goats can be avoided by managing environment and by managing biosecurity within that environment. That is, keeping our goats separate from outside ailments that may affect them. And when I'm talking through some of these diseases, these words are going to come up. And so I want to just talk through them a little bit so that we all have a base understanding. Enteric disease is intestinal disease. So things like coccidiosis and Barber pole worm, things that affect the gut. We're going to talk about respiratory diseases, so things like bronchitis and pneumonia, those things that affect the trachea, or the windpipe of the goat, and also the lungs. And then the nervous system, that can be either the brain or the central nervous system, like the spine. And diseases like this include something like deerworm, which is something that's actually quite common in New York. We're not going to focus too much on nervous system diseases, including Barber or deerworm. Worms are going to be discussed in our next session coming up here next week, next Monday, same time, same place. There are non-infectious diseases, and I would say that non-infectious diseases probably pop up at the same rate as infectious diseases, and these are a lot of the times management driven. So nutritional deficiencies are things like white muscle disease. You may have heard this, where kids are born and they don't have enough selenium in their bodies, and so their muscles end up looking white. They have a hard time functioning, standing, doing goat kid things, and typically don't thrive unless medical intervention is provided. It could also be something like grass tetany, which is actually something that you'll likely have to think about. We're going to be turning goats out soon onto grass, and this really lush, fast-growing grass has low magnesium, which can cause this condition. We have chemical or toxic plant poisoning. So two that come to mind for me are first, poison hemlock. This is something, it looks like wild carrot. When consumed, the goats will develop a photosensitivity. So when they go out into the sun, they'll end up with hair loss and blisters, and it's very uncomfortable. Or something like a fallen cherry tree branch. Wild cherries grow abundantly in Western New York, and I'm sure other parts of New York. I've seen them out east as well. And when those branches are on the tree, they're perfectly fine for the goat. But when they fall down into the paddock and they get a little bit wilty, that's when we got to worry about arsenic poisoning. We also have hereditary defects. Hereditary defects typically pop up in line breeding, with line breeding. Sometimes different genetic lines have issues with certain, maybe breathing defects, maybe eye defects, maybe gait defects, that kind of thing. There are also unknown causes. So goats can get sick, goats can die, and we might not know why. And of course, poor husbandry practices I put on here. There are things like skinny goats, goats with really poor hair coats. Maybe they've got sores or overgrown hooves and their associated issues. So these are all falling in within the non-infectious disease category, but something that we could see if we keep goats. When we think about disease and how we treat disease, and if we treat disease, we want to think about, is it worth treating? And here's kind of the timeline of how disease affects an animal and what will go first in a system. In an animal system, reproduction is generally one of those things that happens only if the animal has enough body fat, has enough groceries, has enough resources to have a baby. Obviously, that's the goal in life, right? You want to live so that you can reproduce and further your species. But if there's something going on with disease, typically that reproduction will stop first, whether that be through abortion, whether that be through lack of catch, so the animals don't breed, something like that. Then something's going on, right? The next thing that you'll see is decreased productivity. So the animals might not gain weight super well. They might lose pounds of milk. They may grow really scrappy looking hair. That may be an indicator that something's going on within that animal's body. The next thing we have to worry about is market loss. So a point where the disease gets so overwhelming to the animal that that animal is no longer suitable for sale. And then after that, we have quarantines and vet visits where the animals are outwardly sick and they're maybe showing extreme symptoms. The vet has to come out, figure out what's going on, provide antibiotics, provide palliative care, that sort of thing. And of course, the most severe outcome to this is the animal loss themselves. Now, before I get into common goat diseases, I want to make a comment that as we go through these presentations, feel free to type your questions into the chat box. We've highlighted this by typing some things in. You'll see a little chat bubble with a number on it, if you haven't looked at the chat box yet. But you can go ahead and type answers or questions at any time, and Caitlin and I will pause periodically throughout the presentation to go ahead and answer those. So, my second question before we get into diseases is, do you have any familiarity with any of these diseases? And if you do, which ones do you have familiarity with? I want you to go ahead and pop your answers into the chat. If you don't know what any goat diseases are off the top of your head, you don't need to put anything or just say, I don't know. And that's okay too. We're here to learn. Let's give everybody about 30 seconds to think about that. Okay, so I'm going to start going through this. I see some foot rot, barber poleworm, CAE and CL, hoof rot. What you've learned in the course so far, great, honest answer. All right, perfect. Thank you everybody for participating. Appreciate that. So it sounds like there is some familiarity with diseases, which is really great. So we'll go into a little bit more detail about each one so that you have something to take home and keep in the back of your brain should you see something out there. All right, so this is a list of the common diseases that I can think of when I think of small herds of goats. But the ones in the box here are probably the most common. The ones on the right-hand side out of the box are ones that we don't encounter as frequently, but are a little more, I'm not going to say they're a little more devastating because worms, intestinal parasites can certainly be devastating. But they're diseases that you won't see as often, but they have pretty severe repercussions. And we'll talk about all of these. So let's start with internal parasites. So the first internal parasite that I want to talk about is barber poleworm. And just this is 30,000 foot because we're going to talk about this on Monday, but barber poleworm is essentially a parasite that is everywhere. Started out in the south, came up north, and it is in all pastures. And we have to manage very carefully around it because it causes anemia in goats and other small ruminants and can be fatal, is typically fatal for those animals with severe infestations just because of anemia. Deerworm is the second one that I want to highlight. This is, again, another one that survives through slugs. Same thing with meningeal worm. Both deerworm and meningeal worm travel through deer as a secondary host. Well, primary host, and then they come into goats as a secondary host, but they travel through slugs. That's the big takeaway here. They travel through slugs. And although I can't see your hands, I want you to raise your hand if you have tons of slugs on your property. And I bet about half of us, at least half of us, have our hands up. Slugs are a huge problem, especially this time of year, especially next week when we go from snow showers. We're supposed to get 2 inches of snow tonight, believe it or not, in Western New York, to warmer weather. But we have that damp environment, and that promotes these. Deerworm and meningeal worm are nervous system bugs. They get into the nervous system and they can wreak havoc, but we can treat them. So more about these very, very common things, come visit us on Monday and we'll chat more about that. The second disease I want to highlight is something called coccidiosis. We also call it cocci, and it is very common in barns that have poor air circulation or they have wet floors, just because this parasite likes the warm and wet environment to proliferate. Typically, you won't see symptoms in animals until 3 weeks after the initial infestation, and most of the time we see this in young animals. Young animals will pick this up by eating off the floor, coming in contact with infected feces that has the little single-celled parasite in it. The parasite will move into their system, reproduce, and embed itself in the intestinal lining. And when we think about the cells of the intestine, that bug is taking up space first, 2, taking nutrition, and 3, when it takes up space, it's going to go ahead and damage that entire intestinal system. So we end up with animals that are unthrifty, that are unable to absorb nutrients, and that just feels super crummy because, of course, if you're not eating, you're going to feel crummy. If these animals are not treated, they will be dead. It's just typically how it goes. If they survive, they're going to be super resistant, but I would urge you to treat them should this be your problem. And if you go ahead and treat the animals with the advisement of a veterinarian, you will treat the entire herd, just simply because this bug, if it's in one animal, it's in everybody. External parasites, another thing that's super common, and this includes lice, mites, fleas, ticks. We all know what those are. We also have these real fun things called bots, bot flies. They will go ahead and the flies will land on the animal, lay their egg in the nostril, and then that little grub will grow and essentially block off the nasal pathway. So it makes it really hard for the animals to breathe. In severe infestations where there's multiple bots, you might end up in a situation where that animal just can't breathe. And then that's where we need to intervene and make sure that we remove those so that the animal can get along just fine. We also have some fly issues, face and body flies. It depends on your environment, how severe they are, but they can be common. Some of these parasites are obligate in that they need a host in order to reproduce. And then once that host is gone, those parasites will no longer be there. Some parasites will always be there regardless of if you have animals on your property or not. And when we think through some of these external parasites, obligate parasites include those like what you see here. These are animal lice. These are actually cattle lice, but sheep and goat lice would be very similar. They are nits. They're lice, they lay eggs. There might be small babies of these lice within the hair of the animal. And the thing with lice is that's super cool is once you treat everybody, typically that's going to solve your problem. There are treatment thresholds, of course, for treating these. And if you have a goat operation such that you're bringing in goats, raising them, and then getting rid of them at the end of the year. Just say you're a meat goat operation, you get little feeder goats in, you feed them, you fatten them up, and then you sell them. You sell them all, you sell in your whole barn. This is a way to break that parasite cycle. So there are others that live in the environment, like the bots, like the face flies, ticks. These are going to be in the environment no matter what. So we've just always got to keep an eye out and manage for them. The next here is pneumonia and respiratory illness. This is super vague because there's a lot of respiratory viruses and bacteria that cause pneumonia, and they all look pretty similar. And to get a definitive diagnosis, you'll have to work with a veterinarian to culture whatever's going on. But typically these animals have snot on their nose, so I'm going to go ahead and highlight this. This animal has some crusties all around its nose. You can see some crusties where it's had some ocular discharge or eye discharge, and that animal just looks real sad and really uncomfortable. Animals with respiratory illness also have difficulty breathing. They'll have excess mucus, which will lead to the crusties, weight loss, and they'll typically be depressed because they just don't feel good. The concern with this disease is, sometimes they'll get over it, sometimes they need a veterinary intervention, but animals like this will typically have a failure to grow and thrive, and if severe enough, they could die. Now let's talk about the more scary and less common ones. Okay, but we do see these. And so when we were talking yesterday about purchasing goats and we talked about limiting buying from terminal markets like auction houses, the reason is because some of these viruses, some of these bacteria, they are there, right? So there's a whole bunch of animals convening in one place. You don't know their histories. They could be passing things back and forth. This is a lot of these diseases is why we make that recommendation to buy from a reputable source. Now, all that said, let's talk about sore mouth. Sore mouth is pretty much what you think it is. It's a sore mouth. It's a viral skin disease. Typically, the lips, the nose, the udder, the teats, where the junction of the hoof meets the leg, maybe the lower leg. So areas where there is more exposed, thinner skin, this is where this virus is going to pop up. Animals that have this will sometimes lose body weight if it's in their mouth because it's simply uncomfortable to eat. They may not grow well because of that. And they may end up being susceptible to other diseases in part because they have a weakened immune system from not eating. And if they're females and they have blisters on their teats, they may not let their kids nurse because it hurts. And so with animals with sore mouth, they can go ahead and pass that from mom to baby first. So that's a concern. But then the second concern is you want to make sure that animals that are affected like this who have kids, you have an intervention ready in the case that that mother won't let her babies feed. This is caseous lymphitis. Caseous, when I hear the word caseous, I think of cottage cheese. It's kind of gross to think about, but like that cheesy kind of substance that comes out of like these pustular sort of infectious balls on the skin. This is caused by a bacterium. It's a pseudotuberculosis. And essentially what happens is that animals that pass it to other animals, typically this is through physical contact, they will develop an abscess at the site of the infection or at a lymph node that's near where the infection started. In this image, the sheep has this condition. You can see that the lymph node has increased in size to the point of where it's ruptured and it's starting to leak that caseous or cheesy bacterial substance down its neck. And at that point, it is highly contagious to other animals and should be separated. This is a chronic wasting disease type disease. So you'll see decreased weight gains, decreased wool growth and quality of wool growth, decreased milk production, and animals with CL also have decreased reproductive capabilities. Typically, this can lead to death. I don't know if it's typical that does lead to death, but it can. And the scary thing about this is that it can transmit to humans. So when you're looking at animals to purchase, when you have animals that may end up with this condition, handle with care, handle with gloves. Most of the time, this is going to be most infectious when the cysts have ruptured and are oozing, but they can still be infectious otherwise. So just take care if you see this around your animals. This is one of those ones where if it's in your herd, it's there. It's always kind of there, and you can cull real hard to get rid of it typically. All right. Yonis is our next one. I don't know how common this is in goats in New York State. I know it's really common in cattle, but it's something to look out for. It's caused by a bacterium and it results in rapid weight loss and typically diarrhea. But the interesting part is that even though these animals aren't doing so hot, this animal looks like a hot mess. They still eat fine. So they're eating, but they're not able to absorb those nutrients. Tricky part about yonis is that it doesn't really show up until a little bit later in the animal's life. Animals can do okay with it up to a point, but those animals that are infected, if they're does, they can transmit that disease through the placenta to their kids. So if you have yonis on your farm, it's very difficult to get rid of unless you blood test, find those affected individuals, and cull really heavily. Culling mean sell those animals for an end purpose. Typically that's going to be meat, but getting rid of those animals so that you don't have those infected individuals on your farm. Caprine arthritis encephalitis. This is caused by a virus, and encephalitis essentially means swelling of, right? So this photo by Michigan State University shows the swelling of hock joints on an affected animal. And on this animal on the right-hand picture, we see as like a mastitis-like appearance of this. That would be her left hind quarter. Symptoms are really varied in this. There's not one reason why, one symptom that they may show. You may see all sorts of stuff: stiffness in the joints, lameness, weight loss, mastitis, pneumonia. The list goes on and on and on, or they might not show symptoms. So if you see some different symptoms within your herd and you're not sure what's going on, it might be good to test for CAE. The concern is that it's contagious. It spreads from infected mothers to kids through milk production. It can also spread what's called horizontally, so from affected goat to affected adult goat. And there's really no treatment available. It's just good to know if you've got it, and if you've got it in certain goats and you can confirm with a blood test, then you can do the same thing. Cull real heavy, get rid of those animals that are affected, remove them from your premise, and then keep testing until you come up negative. And that is one way to control this disease. This will be our last one, and then we'll take a stop for questions. So if you have any burning questions, pop them in the chat. So pink eye is our last one. Pink eye is relatively common. It happens. It's one of those things where we've got the bacteria within the environment. It is always there, and it enters the eye when the eye sustains an injury. This could be the goat is running through a field of foxtails and gets scraped in the eye. This could be the goat scratches its head off a wooden post and accidentally scratches its eye. It could be that a fly lands on its face. You've got face flies, and they're sucking the moisture from around the eye, and in doing that, they're biting the eye, and that can lead to the introduction of bacteria into that eye. Animals get weepy, blinking eyes, and eventually what happens is the eyes get cloudier and cloudier and cloudier. And if the condition's not resolved, typically by veterinary intervention, which may include injections into the eye itself, the animal will go blind, or some type of blindness, like some range of blindness. These animals that are infected are contagious, so they can then pass it from animal to animal. Typically, it's going to be through those flies, and it is hard to cure once it's in the farm. It leads to weight loss, reduced weight gains, and that's simply because the animals cannot see where their food and water is. So again, common, can be treatable. There's not a good vaccine out there for it. I know that I might get that question, so I'll say that ahead of time. It's just one of those things that we got to watch out for and manage for. This goat has a pretty, I'd say it's a moderate infection. So you can still see the different parts of the eye through there, and it's likely that this animal can still see. But once you get to the point of where it's totally clouded over, like this image down here in the bottom right-hand corner, that animal's not going to see to get along. So, all right, I'm going to take a little break because that was a lot of information in a very short time, and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Amy. We did have a couple of questions regarding, I think, referring back to when you were mentioning Johne's disease and how if you had an animal test positive, you would need to cull them, sell them at a terminal market.
Yeah.
So we had a question about asking if you can sell the meat of ill animals. So I commented in that as long as the animal is able to walk and stand on their own, they can be sold at a terminal market. And for food safety purposes, for the food system, all meat is tested for any communicable diseases that could be passed to humans. Additionally, though, like another consideration, particularly if you treated that animal with anything. So if that animal was sick and you treated them with antibiotics or some other treatment, then you need to refer to the label of that drug to see what the withholding period is. So for example, if you give an animal an antibiotic, you might have to not send them to auction for a month for meat consumption. So you should have that conversation with your vet too before you get rid of any animals, particularly if you were treating them with anything.
Right. Yep.
So perfect. So then we had a follow-up question about the ethnic market. How does that affect it? I commented in that with the ethnic market or folks that are coming to your farm and purchasing the animal for slaughter or ritual purposes for themselves, with that setup, you are selling a live animal to the buyer. You are not selling meat to the buyer. So at that point, the buyer assumes all risk. For moral reasons, you should be communicating with your buyer if you do suspect that that animal has any illnesses or you did treat that animal. But in that setup, the buyer is purchasing a live animal.
Yep. And that's the only legal way to do it. Some farms do have the option of slaughtering on farm. That's a whole conversation that we could get into because that has some very interesting insurance requirements for some insurance carriers. And that does increase your risk as a farmer. But to do that ritual slaughter on farm, you will need to sell that animal in advance. Money will need to switch hands before that buyer touches that goat. So it's something else to keep in mind.
It looks like at this point, that is all of our questions.
Okay, very cool. All right, so let's move on to nutritional and metabolic disease. These are things, again, these are management things that we can manage around pretty easily. I'm just going to list some here. I will read off my list. This is not all inclusive. So we have milk fever, which is low blood calcium. Typically, we see this just after the animal's given birth, right as they're entering lactation. Mostly dairy breeds are going to be affected by this, but some meat breeds could be as well. Pregnancy toxemia, low blood sugar, typically seen at the last trimester of pregnancy. Grass tetany, we already talked about this, improper magnesium to calcium ratio caused by low magnesium in fast-growing grass. White muscle disease, lack of selenium, especially in selenium deficient soils such as ours in New York State. So having Bosi on hand or some other selenium increasing drug is good to have on hand, again, with the recommendation of a veterinarian. Grain fever. This is a fancy name for lactic acidosis, where the animal goes into a feed bin, eats themselves silly, and then has bloat or acidosis. Then we have urinary calculi, which can happen more so in male goats than female goats, simply because their urethra or their pee tube is longer in a male versus a female. And this is from too much phosphorus in relation to calcium in the diet. A lot of times feeds will be fortified in order to prevent urinary calculi in goats. So take a look out for that. And of course, there are many, many more, but these are some of the more common ones. So let's talk prevention. What can I do to prevent my goats from getting sick? And this is all coming down to biosecurity, making sure you're getting your animals from reliable sources. If you visit somebody who has goats on their property, don't enter their goat pens unless you have clean boots that you haven't worn in your goat facilities. And if you wear those boots, completely wash and sanitize them prior to going into your own goat pens. Don't haul disease home. Again, with the auction, making sure that you're going to reputable places to purchase animals and knowing the warning signs of infectious disease so that if you see an animal that may be sporting some of those signs, you say, okay, nope, we're not going to purchase that animal and bring it home. Quarantining is another one of those things that we can do, and we talked about that with buying a goat, so I'm not going to belabor that anymore. But keeping goats separate for about 3 weeks prior to introduction to your current set of goats is going to be helpful in mitigating disease issues that may crop up. This is my version of paperwork. I don't talk paperwork a lot, but I am really up on keeping records. Keep them, keep them, keep them. It doesn't take a whole lot. They don't need to be anything fancy. They can be just written on a calendar. They can be written in a pocket notebook. They could be written on scraps of paper that you keep in a singular place so that you always know where those scraps of paper are. It's good to keep a number of the source of goats, the number of goats, and what their birth dates are so that you understand what their ages are, in part for breeding management, also for whole herd management. Daily feed and water consumption, this might not be something that you write down, but more of something that you eyeball and say, okay, I see that they're eating this amount of feed, so that if something happens and feed and water consumption changes, you'll be alerted right away, there's something going on in my herd. Vaccinations, medications, these are essential to keep track of. As Caitlin mentioned, we have withdrawal times on a lot of our antibiotics, some of our antiparasitics as well, especially animals for meat consumption and animals for dairy consumption. Sometimes these withdrawal times are really, really long. And so I would, if you're thinking about getting rid of an animal that you're treating, make sure that you're treating it with something that is effective, but has a withdrawal time that meets what you anticipate in terms of your timeline for ultimately selling that animal. Of course, past history is really good to keep and to keep your herd in sound managed condition. This can include breeding dates, kinning dates, the number of kids that were born, if there was a hard kidding, if that animal has had chronic mastitis, if you medicate it regularly, that sort of thing. And of course, their last FOMACHA exam, which is that internal parasite check to see if they have anemia.
Related to your comment about withholding times and recording that, there was another question asking about for dairy goats, are there any sicknesses where you shouldn't use their milk or if they are on antibiotics? So this information's in the chat too, but just to clarify it here, withholding times, withdrawal times, they apply to dairy production too. So any drugs that you're giving to your goats, on the label, it will say, don't, consume the milk within 30 days or 10 days or whatever it is for whatever drug you're using. And as Amy mentioned, that can be a consideration when you are choosing what to give your goat. If you're giving anything off-label, which happens sometimes with goats. So off-label means the product that you are treating that goat with is not labeled specifically for goats. There's not dosage for goats. There's not withholding times for goats. You need to work with your veterinarian in order to use that drug and ask your veterinarian what withholding date you should apply. Typically, the vets are going to be extremely conservative because if it's not labeled for goats, then there's no testing to show when that residue won't be in the milk anymore. So just listen to what they say, even if it's a really long number, it's to keep everybody safe. As far as illnesses, if the animal is sick with anything that is communicable to humans, so things like sormo, CL, don't consume that milk. Not everything travels through the milk, but you're going to be touching the animal, which you could pick up those germs. If you're using a machine, if you're not properly sanitizing, that can still enter it. So just blanket recommendation, don't consume the milk if they're sick with something that you could also get sick with. And then finally, if they're sick with something that isn't transmittable to humans, but it's affecting the quality of the milk, so particularly with mastitis, technically you can drink milk that has mastitis. It's going to taste disgusting and it's going to look gross. So just don't do it. Even if
it's a hard no.
You probably shouldn't. Exactly.
Don't make cheese with it either.
Exactly. Don't do it. Also, it'll affect the shelf life of that too, because there's more bacteria in that milk. So that milk's going to go bad. So in general, if you are in a place where you're not relying on milk and meat from sick animals, it's always best to just not consume milk or meat from sick animals to keep yourself safe, keep your family safe, keep your customers safe. According to the rules, though, anytime you're giving drugs and any communicable diseases, we shouldn't be drinking the milk for that.
Mhm.
And then we had another question come in right now. Can chickens give goats lice? This is
I
a tough one, so I'm going to let Amy handle it.
Oh yeah, thanks. So I know some of the external parasites are species specific. Lice. Okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna look that up over the break and let you know. I'm not gonna give you an answer until I find that answer. So good question though.
That looks like all of the questions for now. Thank you, Amy.
Okay, I'm just making a note here. Lice
Oh,
and
one
chicken.
more, sorry.
Yep, you're good.
Mary was asking, what do you do with the milk? Can other goats drink it? If you shouldn't, I think is
No.
the answer that we're going to
No.
give you.
Yeah.
Theoretically you could, right? So if you have milk that's got mastitic milk, you can feed that to kids as like a milk replacer type thing. But again, the quality is not going to be there. Your nutrients aren't going to be there. So unless you like absolutely need it, just don't do it. Just dump that milk. Same thing with antibiotics or some other type of drug residue. So we're specifically telling that label is telling us don't use this milk because there's residue here. So if you turn around and feed that milk to other animals, then those animals are also ingesting the antibiotic and are also subject to withdrawal times. So the best thing to do is, if that milk is not safe for consumption, is to just dump it. Just dump it. It's really sad and it's really hard to do it, right? But that's the safest thing that you can do to make sure you're not inadvertently putting something that shouldn't be in the food system.
Yep. 100% agree. And to Caitlin's point about withdrawal times passing to other animals, they may have different withdrawal times than goats. Goats are ruminants. They have different digestive systems than pigs, than chickens, right? So if we're feeding some of that treated milk out, we don't know what the withdrawal time is. We can't make assumptions that it's the same. So yeah, safely dump it, then you know that you're safe.
All right, that's good. Thank you.
Cool.
Amy.
Yep, thank you, Caitlin. All right, so let's talk about air quality. Goats are hard for a variety of reasons. They're wonderful, but they're hard. And one of the reasons why they're hard is because they require really good air quality in order to not get sick. Part of that is the coccidiosis issue, which I shared earlier, which mainly affects young animals. But there's also other respiratory diseases that these goats may get if they are exposed to a high moisture, damp, or cold and damp environment. Typically, dry environments are going to be much safer for animals, even if they are on the cold side. So moisture release happens during both urination, defecation, and breathing. Happens all the time. And we're going to see most moisture buildup in the winter time when we've got those windows closed to try to keep heat in. But like I said, it's probably a better idea to add airflow to that barn where there's not a breeze going over the animals, maybe necessarily, but there's still airflow to pull some of that wet air out of the barn and introduce drier air in, even if it is colder air in the winter time. This can be done with either an inlet or fan system. So right here we see a barn here with a controlled thermostat and a fan. This is pretty high tech. We can, as small herd owners, get a hold of this kind of technology. But generally all you need is an inlet, typically under the rafters of the building, that will be sized appropriately to the fan. The fan will go ahead and exhaust out moisture, and the thermostat will regulate according to temperature. Sometimes there's a hygrometer, so a humidity reader, and they will adjust the fan speed based on humidity too. So the one thing I want to leave you with, in addition to everything else I've left you with, but I want to share, learning what's normal in your goats is going to take time, especially if you're new to raising goats. Work with your goats daily. Pay attention to how they act in their environment. Pay attention to how they act during different seasons and different seasons of their lives. So if they're mamas or if they're entering breeding time, What's normal for them? How do they look? How do they eat? How do they move? How does their coat look? And always be on the lookout for those that ain't doing right, because typically if they're a little different or something's off, something's off. Goats are prey animals. They're not going to show that they're sick until they're really sick. Um, some things in their environment to think about. How does their feces look? Diarrhea is typically not great. We sometimes see that when they're on a very high protein diet, but we can also see it if they're really sick. Air feeling and odor is something to pay attention to. So when you walk into the barn, do you smell manure gas? If you do, you should increase ventilation. When you walk in there, does a wall of humidity hit you in the face? If so, we should increase ventilation. And yeah, so those are some basic ideas, some things to keep in mind as we're keeping goats. And with that, I want to answer any questions that may have come up, but let's see what time it is. Let's take a 3-minute bio break. So get up, stretch, do your thing, and we'll reconvene here at 7:48.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Amy. Still can't hear you. Let me try this.
All right, so you took away my permission.
I don't think oops, I didn't mean to.
That's okay. We're good. We're good. So thank you all. Welcome back. We're going to check the chat real quick to see any questions as Caitlin is getting her presentation up and ready. All right. So we have a question here. What is your protocol to prevent milk fever? Do you find feeding alfalfa 30 days prior to kidding helps? Oh, that's a lot of questions in one place. I'm not going to speak to this because I don't have a protocol to prevent milk fever. It's kind of one of those things where if an animal is a high producing animal, the chances are that they're going to be more likely to encounter this.
I would say like I know that there's a lot on the internet of try this, try that, hope it's a full moon and feed alfalfa that you picked by hand, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm not trying to make fun at that either, but I think that a lot of the protocols are going to be farm specific.
Mhm.
So it's really tough to apply a blanket recommendation for preventing milk fever. Um, in my very humble opinion, the best thing that you can do is prepare those animals even before they go into like a dry off period, if you're using a dry off period, right? So even before you start breeding them, making sure that they have really good condition, you've got high quality hay. You can sometimes do just as much damage by overfeeding them nutritionally than underfeeding them nutritionally. And sometimes feeding alfalfa hay can be overfeeding them, depending on the quality of the hay. So the other thing that I would say too is like, how often is it happening? If it's one animal every few years, then that's, and that's not an economic threshold. That's not happening enough that this is a herd-wide problem. If all of your animals are getting milk fever, then you need to start doing some forage sampling. You need to potentially, depending on where your feed's coming from, sample your feed, and you need to work with your veterinarian because that's indicating that there's a bigger problem. And I'm super hesitant to say anything more because it is with goats more so than like other animal species, particularly dairy cows, right? Milk fever is definitely herd specific in my experience based on what your forages are, what your animals are, what your production looks like. Tell me if that's wrong or not wrong, Amy.
No, that's totally right. And that's kind of why I said, "Ooh, that's a loaded question," because yeah, it's really hard. So if you just say you have some really chonky animals that are coming into their last stage of pregnancy, feeding them a high quality feed might put them at risk for some metabolic disorders or kidding issues or, a lot of different things. So, if you have any questions, I'd talk to somebody who can get on your farm and take a look at your animals and make those recommendations. So good question. Sorry, we didn't have a better answer for you. It's the extension answer. It depends. I do want to touch base again on the lice question. So can chickens give goats lice? And the answer is no. And I wanted to verify that. I was like 95% sure, but I wanted to make sure. Yeah, they're species specific. There are a couple of species that can transmit, but the ones that are in chickens, not typically. There's not enough similarities because they're living off of two different types of hosts. So you're good to go there. All right, Caitlin, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. So I'm going to be talking about hoof health. Hoof health, hoof care can be one of the biggest issues, and time sucks for raising goats, regardless of if it's a dairy goat or a meat goat. So this is why we're dedicating a whole half of a presentation to this topic, even though it's just one part of raising goats. As Amy said, please continue to drop any questions that you might have in the chat as we go along. Happy to pause and address those. Tonight we'll also be featuring some videos of catching and restraining goats, diagnosing hoof problems, and actually trimming hoofs. You'll be receiving links for all of these videos. So if for some reason, and we're trying to keep our bandwidth as low as possible tonight to help with any quality issues, but if for some reason the videos are coming through blurry for you, everyone will be getting the links to watch these videos. They're all up on YouTube, so you can watch them at your leisure. Okay, so we're gonna skip past that. So I'm gonna cover preventing hoof issues. We're gonna provide a hoof trimming demonstration. We'll talk about different hoof care issues, things that might pop up while you're trimming hoofs. And of course, my favorite topic is record keeping. So I believe that hoof health, any hoof issues that you might run into, you're going to be better off putting your time and energy into preventing problems than dealing with those problems. So a good offense is always better than a good defense. Did I word that right? I might not have worded that right. I don't play the sports thing, so I apologize if that didn't land. Moving on. I'm really good at talking about goats though. One of the biggest things that you can do to prevent any hoof issues is to implement a regular trimming schedule. Your trimming schedule is going to look different based on your herd's qualities, and what type of housing they're in. If you're just getting started with goats, a good schedule is every 6 to 8 weeks. After you do that a few times, if you're going to trim hooves and their hooves haven't grown that much, they don't have any problems, then you could drop that back. If you're recognizing that 6 to 8 weeks is still not close enough, then you can trim more often. The other thing that's going to affect your trimming schedule is where the animals are in the stage of their lives. So if they are getting a lot of feed, their hooves are going to grow faster. If they're outside on pasture where there's rocks, their hooves are not going to need trimmed as often. So start out with 6 to 8 weeks as a general rule of thumb, and then adjust from there. The next thing you can do to prevent hoof issues is providing a balanced diet. So our pleasantly plump goats that get lots of treats will have hoof problems. The extra grain can cause problems with laminitis, founder. It's going to, just like people, when we take lots of vitamins, right, and minerals, our hair grows so much faster, our nails grow stronger. The same thing happens with goats. So if we're overfeeding grain, we're overfeeding supplements, or we're overfeeding treats, we can create hoof problems because those hooves are going to grow too fast. They're going to grow with soft tissue, and they're going to be more susceptible to lesions, to foot scald, and even foot rot. So only grain as needed. Depending on what kind of goat you have, it's going to change how much feed you actually have to feed. But as Amy was talking about last night, monitoring the body condition of the score, if those goats do start to get a little rounded, a little bit more pleasantly plump than they need to be, pull back on the grain. If your goats are skinnier than they need to be, add a little bit more grain. Monitor their body condition score and pull back on grain when needed, and that will help prevent hoof issues. I also think it's a good idea to provide environmental fun. So these are things like old concrete blocks, big rocks, foot soaking tubs, things that are going to help prevent any foot issues. For example, this is our summer pasture for our goats. We have a ton of boulders and some concrete rubble out in the pasture, and the goats just naturally play on that, and that helps to grind down their feet. When they're in the barn in the wintertime, we don't have that. So we're noticing that we have to go out and trim feet more often. Foot soaking tubs aren't necessary unless you have consistent foot issues. So if for some reason there's hoof rot on your farm, you're consistently finding hoof rot, then implementing a foot soaking tub someplace can be a tool that you can use to provide application of copper, for example, to help treat any foot issues. So again, it's not necessary unless you have an issue, then it's another tool that you can use. I also think that a good prevention is to purchase, like we were talking about last night, purchase your goats from reputable sources. So hoof rot is contagious. You can bring hoof rot onto your farm, and it can take you years to get rid of. Now it's naturally occurring too, but it's very contagious from goat to goat. So if you're bringing issues onto your farm, it can take you a really long time to get rid of those. Also, some lines of goats, breedings of goats, will be more susceptible to hoof issues than others will. These are breed characteristics, but they're also animal characteristics. So purchase animals from reputable sources where you can ask them, what is your hoof trimming schedule? What does that look like? How often are you finding issues with your hoofs? So when we are thinking about hoof trimming, there's some supplies that we really recommend having on hand. And we put together a video of those supplies and putting together a hoof care kit. On our farm, I have a lot of this stuff just in a plastic tub, but it's all in one place. So when I'm getting ready to hoof trim, I can go to that tub, pull everything out, put everything back in one spot, and it's just our designated hoof trimming plastic tub, pail, whatever works for you. So this first video talks about putting together your hoof.
So now I'm going to show you what types of supplies you might want to consider to keep on hand to trim goat feet. The first thing that we're going to want to think about is safety. So we're working with live animals that have horns and hooves, and we're working with sharp shears or hoof trimmers. And these can be really scary combinations. So some things that I like to keep on hand are some protective gloves. The difficult part with full leather, fully protective gloves is that it can be hard to maneuver the trimmers and the hooves at the same time. So what I like to use are plastic coated type gardening gloves, and I found that those protect me enough, but I'm still able to use the equipment in the way that I need to use it. Some other things that I keep on hand, I actually have overalls that I use. This helps give me a little bit of protection from getting a horn in my thigh, which hurts really bad. And if I accidentally slip with the trimmers, it'll protect me from cutting my legs. And then you're going to look really dorky while you're doing it, but I've gotten too many hoof trimmings in my eyeball, so I wear clear safety glasses just to protect. So as you're trimming, you've got hoof shards flying everywhere, and this can be really important to protect your eyes. Along with safety first, the next thing that I would consider using is a halter. If you have a stand that you can use to trim feet and perform other activities related to health maintenance on goats, you can use that. But if you don't have a stand, picking up a rope halter and finding a strategic corner can be really helpful. And in our video, we'll show you how you go about putting a halter on and catching a goat. The next thing that I try to keep on hand is just a bucket and some Epsom salts. So sometimes if goats are out on pasture, for example, or in the barn, their hooves might become really dirty over time, and it can make for a really hard situation to try to trim their hooves. So what I do is I usually put about a cup of Epsom salts into a bucket about this size with some very warm, not hot, but very warm water, and I'll let that goat soak her hoof for between 5 and 10 minutes, depending on how bad the hoof is. The other thing too is that if that hoof has any type of hoof rot, ulcer, puncture, the Epsom salts will soothe everything and you're not going to hurt anything. So 10 out of 10 recommend a big bulk bag of Epsom salts when it comes to any type of hoof trimming. The other thing that it does too is it does soften up the hoof. So if you have hooves that might be overgrown, you can actually soak them for even longer, so 15-20 minutes, and it'll help soften that hoof so that you're able to trim it a little bit more efficiently. So up next are the actual hoof trimming tools. So what I have here is a brush and a pick. You can use this to help clean the hoof if you need to, and to help pick any dirt or debris that might be in that hoof. These are a pair of what they call hoof rat shears. They're very heavy duty. They're meant to take off large snaps of hoof at a time. And to be honest, they were made for a man. So these are really hard to navigate depending on the size of your hand and the strength of your forearms. They work really well for some people. They don't work well for other people. Again, these are called hoof rat shears. The good news is that they're heavy duty and they will last forever. I use something that's a little bit smaller. They're just marketed as hoof trimmers. They work better at nipping, and you'll actually see these in use in the video. I do recommend spending a little bit more money on these than kind of what you can find for $10 or $15 at your farm supply store. These ones I think were around $50 or $60, and the blades, you're able to sharpen them over time and they just last a lot longer. So you will get your money's worth if you buy hoof trimmers that maybe are a little bit more expensive. Some other things to keep on hand. This is just some rubbing alcohol that I use to disinfect my hoof trimmers in between goats, so I'm not passing along any type of bacteria, hoof rot, infection that might be there from goat to goat, and just keep my trimmers clean. And then plastic gloves, if you're not using protective gloves, sometimes we can get into some nasty hooves that smell bad, and that smell lingers on your hands for days. So plastic gloves can help to protect against that. So sometimes if you're working with a hoof that might have some type of hoof rot or hoof scald or some other type of sore issue, you might want to use a product that contains zinc. Zinc sulfate is in this product that I use. It's a hoof bath, hoof soaking type material. So what I do is I will essentially spray or drip this onto the hoof and keep that hoof off the ground for a few minutes to let it soak in. Zinc is really helpful for any type of hoof issues that we might run into. Now we're going to work on catching.
Okay, so that was your hoof trimming kit. And in the comments too, we're not allowed to recommend like specific products or specific brands, but in the comment, if I was allowed to recommend, that would be the ones that I would recommend. So there's a few. I've tried several different hoof trimmers throughout the years, and everybody has their own. But the ones that are in the chat are very great for beginners and non-beginners. They're smaller and they're easier to manage. I've seen people recommend using, and I've done it too, using like tree pruners. If you ever get in a bind and you're out trimming feet and your hoof trimmers break and you want to keep going, you can't make it to some place where you can buy a good set. Hoof trimmers will, or excuse me, like tree trimmers, shrub trimmers will work in a bind, but you're going to find that after you trim 1 or 2 feet, they get out of alignment and don't work anymore. So I think that it's good. It's a good idea to invest in a set of hoof trimmers up front. There's also not in this video options for rotary trimmers. So these would be kind of like on a machine, like a Dremel with a small disc, sanding disc or grinding disc. I would say that these are not for beginners because you can do a lot of damage. So start out with a smaller handheld trimmer, get comfortable with what the hoof feels like, what it looks like. And then as you keep going, you can work your way up to some of the bigger machines, the bigger materials. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about properly restraining the animal in order to hoof trim. So we have to remember that goats are animals and they are tough and they are big and they can really, really hurt us. Hoof trimming can be a scary experience for them, and we want to try to make it as calm and easy for both us and for the goats. And one way that we can do that and ensure the safety of both the animal and ourselves is through properly restraining the goats. The best thing to do is to have some type of a stand. So you can purchase a stand, you can build a stand like what's in this picture. That's great. The drawback to building a stand is, or buying one, is that you have to train the animals to use it, or else they can also get hurt. And that takes time, but it's doable. And you have to be able to move it around or move your goats to wherever the stand is. And depending on your system, that might not be something that you can do. For beginners, or if you're just getting started, or if you need a system that's a little bit more flexible than a stand, you can use halter and some type of corner or a wall that you can back them into. I would also recommend having a helper if you're just getting started. So the biggest thing, regardless of what you are interested in using, is to make sure that you're not chasing the animal around trying to get them caught. You're not yelling at them. We don't want to take an animal that's already in fight or flight mode and try to get them to stand on a stand and not move, right? Or try to stand still while we are hoof trimming. So have some help when you're first getting started. Have a plan in place for how you're going to properly restrain them. And then we are going to look at a video now that talks about properly restraining a goat. This is an example. This is a lovely face of mine. This is an example of if your goats were out on pasture and you needed to catch them. Oh, go ahead, Amy. Sorry.
Yeah, we do have a question here. How do you know how much hoof to trim? Are there any markers on the hoof to guide you? Well, we will share this with you coming up here in this next couple of videos.
Absolutely. Good question. We have a couple of videos that we're going to show. Amy and we were out in my fields with a little iPhone camera and trying to catch all of our goats. So we will show you exactly when to stop trimming, and you'll be able to replay that video over and over again. So
Yes.
you can see. All right, so this video is going to talk about properly restraining a goat to hoof trim them. This again is an example if you were out on pasture and you needed a little bit more of a flexible system than a stand.
Now we're going to work on catching some goats to hoof trim them. In a situation like this where these goats are out on pasture, it makes it a little bit trickier to try to catch them versus when they're in the barn. So we're going to show you what trimming would look like on a few different animals. These guys in particular did get trimmed before they were turned out to pasture, so their hooves won't be as overgrown as we might see when animals are outside and on pasture where they might have rocks or other things to kind of crawl on. We actually have some concrete blocks that they jump around on. It does wear their hooves down more than them being inside in the barn. So trimming isn't as necessary. But as you'll see while we're taking these videos, we have one that's limping. So we'll get to take a look and see what's going on with her. So the first thing that we're going to do is try to catch them as safely as we can. I probably am going to regret doing this on video, but it'll be okay. So you can see that in this pasture setup, we've got some hog panels that essentially create a little bit of a corral. What we do is we feed them here every day, so they're used to coming to this area, so it's not a big deal for them to come in here, and then I can kind of try to catch them. I am going to use a halter as my main restraining method, and in order to do that, I very calmly corner the goat. I will wrestle her. Essentially, I'll show you how that hold looks and put the halter on her, so wish me luck. Okay, so usually with goats, especially ones that might be a little bit more friendly, by the time you can kind of catch them around their neck and their heads, they kind of calm down. So all I'm doing right now is I have one hand that's underneath her chin, one hand that's on the other side of her neck, and I'm using my body weight to kind of push her to the side a little bit. This is just a simple rope halter. The way that I do it is I put the first part over their nose and then loop it around their ears. The reason that I do it that way is that then if they're trying to push out of it, the nose part's at least there. Okay, so it fits. The one loop goes around her 2 ears, one loop goes over the bridge of her nose, and then we tighten it up. And this is just meant as a way to restrain the animal. Now what I'm going to do, because I don't have a stand to trim on, I'm going to use the corner of our corral here as a way to hold her tight to one side. So I'll take the halter and I'll tie her to this pole right here. I'm just tying it at where her natural head height would be. If you tie it too high, they can hang themselves. If you tie it too low, they can essentially somersault over. So usually if we can hold it to where her natural head height would be, it just helps to keep her safe and it keeps me safe too. So now I'll show you.
Okay, you probably won't believe us, but that was our first take of that video, and our goats were happy, they were calm, and I was like, oh good, that was a great job, goats. So we mostly just wanted to show you that even if you didn't have a stand or didn't have the funds to start out with a stand, you can still create a system with hog panels, with using the corner of a wall, having some help that can make it safe for both you and for the goat. So now we're going to talk about hoof trimming. If we're thinking about the hoof, some common terms that you hear are toe, this is the tip of the hoof, wall, this is the outer shell of the hoof, this is going to be tougher, it's going to be thicker, and this is the part that can sometimes grow over and create some issues. The sole is the flat bottom of the hoof, and I just lost my train of thought. The heel. The heel is the back of the hoof. So this is the rounded part in the rear. when we think about trimming, the way that we want to do it is first we want to clean off the hoof. So we're going to dig any dirt out that's up by the toe area. We're going to look over the feet and just see if we visually see any issues. So if there's any bleeding, if there's any oozing, if there's any swelling or soreness, we'll do that first. So then we might know like what we're working with. If you have a goat with a sore hoof, save the sore hoof for last. There's a few different reasons. If you start out with a sore hoof, you're just going to piss the goat off right from the beginning because she's uncomfortable and now you're digging at her sore hoof, right? So you have no chance of doing the rest of the hoofs. But then if that hoof has something like foot rot, foot scald, something that can be transferred between animals, it can also be transferred between that same animal's hoofs. So it's completely possible to keep a hoof rot or hoof scald on one hoof without transferring it to other ones. And the best way you can do that is by saving the hoof that might have some issues for last. You're going to cut away the outer wall first. This is the harder part that grows on the edge. You're going to start with the toe and then work your way back. And we'll show you a video of this too, which is why I'm going a little bit faster. If you find anything that's rotten or soft, you're going to trim that. And then you're going to trim the heel. You want the heel to be parallel to the hairline. So on the hoof, there's the actual hoof, and then you'll see the hair from the goat's leg. The hair is going to make a somewhat straight line, and you want the hoof to make the same somewhat straight line. You can do the dew claws. Oh, I just saw a question pop up in the chat about dew claws. Perfect. You can trim the dew claws. The dew claws are these upper protrusions on their leg, but it's not necessary. So dew claws typically won't get infected. They won't get lesions. They won't get hurt. We worry about them if they get too long that they could potentially get caught on something. So like those hog panels that were in the past video, if an animal had really long dew claw, that could get caught on the hog panel and get ripped off. For the most part, though, you really don't need to trim goat dew claws. And if you do, it's only a little bit. We're really, really focusing on the actual hoof and particularly the heels and where the heel is meeting the skin. So dew claws are going to be low on the priority level. You would only trim them if they're very long. And I'll tell, like, I have never really seen goats get extremely long dew claws. I had a friend that sent me a picture one time where the dew claw was down to the hoof. And in that case, like, yes, go ahead and trim. But that's the only time that I've ever seen a dew claw that really needed to be trimmed. Okay, so and if anybody else has any experiences or photos of long dew claws, please let me know, because I have never found a definitive answer for this of like, so which goats get long dew claws and which ones don't. So now we're going to actually watch some videos of hoof trimming. The first video we're going to watch is of a front leg, and then we're going to show you a rear leg so that you see two hooves and you see how we pick up a front leg and how we pick up a rear leg.
So now I'll show you front hoof. It's basically the same thing. We're just going to pick it up a little bit differently because.
Whoops, and I've already gotten these out of order. So give me just 1 second.
All right, so now we're going to work on hoof trimming. As you can tell, I'm not wearing my safety goggles or my safety overalls or my gloves that we talked about in the last video. So you'll have to forgive me for this, but I do have my clean, sharp clippers. As I mentioned, it's a personal favorite for what types of clippers work best for you. For me, with the size of my hands, these ones work the best and are a little bit easier for me to handle. This mom is still nursing a kid that's going to be weaned very shortly, so the kid will kind of be around and we're just going to shoo her out of the way. And what we'll do is we will start with a back leg here. So because I don't have a stand, I'm going to use my body weight to gently push her against this hog panel. The hog panel is not very sturdy, so I don't want to push her too hard because it could flop over. I'm going to run my hand down her leg so she knows to expect my touch. And I'm going to pick her foot up. And I'm going to let her calm down for a second. And there we go. So you can see that this hoof is starting to get a little bit overgrown, which is great for today's purposes. Hoofs always grow from the outside. So you can see that the edges are getting longer. And then over time, the heels extend out as well. When we're looking at hoof health, we're just going to make sure that there's no soreness in between the two cloves. You can see that that is a healthy interdermal area. We can touch this and it doesn't seem like anything sore or pussy or leaking. So this just looks like a typical overgrown hoof. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our clippers, and it's always best to go slow, just like you would cut a kid's fingernails. If you go too far, it'll hurt really bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by trimming down these edges that we can obviously tell are overgrown. I'm going to take small snips, and I'm going to try to get these edges level to the center of that hoof. Once I get that down a little bit, what I can actually do is this tip of the hoof, I can cut that off to a blunt edge. Again, taking small snips, and then continue to even up these outer hooves. Our goal is to get this flat. Doesn't always happen, but it's a good goal to have. Now that I'm starting to get down a little bit farther, I'm going to come to the back and take very small snips. You want to go until you start to see some pink flesh, and that's when we're going to stop, because that means that we're getting close to the nail bed. Oh, hold on, big girl. Okay, so you can just start to see it. We're not there yet, but getting a little bit closer. This is how much she likes this. So I'm going to come back here and take another small snip. And at this point, we're just going to try to even everything out. So you can see right here at this tip, there's just a little bit of pink. So that's as far as we're going to go. Right there is where the blood vessels start. If we go any farther, we could risk injuring her hoof. But we want to get as close as we can so that we're not trimming hoofs every single day. So knowing this is kind of my stopping point, I'm going to work backwards and just try to even everything out as best I can. Taking very small snips as we go along. This looks like might just be a growth of the hoof. So I'm going to trim that off so it doesn't get caught on anything. There we go. And I'd say for these purposes, that's pretty good. So now I'll do the other side a little bit quicker. And right here, oops, I just picked it out. That was just debris. So you can use the edge of your pliers to clean that out if that gives you a better sight line. Careful. Okay, there you go. Sometimes you'll get the outer edges lower than the middle, and that's okay. The biggest thing that we're trying to do is just go for the best we can get, especially because these goats are out on pasture where they can rub their hoofs down. That middle part will rub down on its own. And if you look at it from this side, you can see that we've cut down quite a bit of that heel, and the front's a little bit more blunt, and this will give her a more even spot to walk on. These ones, the dew claws, if they get too long, you can trim them. It doesn't affect the health of the animal at all, so I just leave them alone. And that's her back hoof. We noticed that.
Okay, so now we're gonna watch a video of a front hoof. I did want to show on this one, we didn't trim down as far as I normally would have, just because we were taking too long already. So let me just show you this picture right here. So remember how we mentioned that a good indicator is that you've trimmed parallel to the hairline. So you'll see we did that up front, and that's where you started to notice the pink, right? That's where we noticed the pink first. So if I were to do this again, I would have taken off just a little bit more on the hoof or the heel side of things. So maybe like up to here to make it a little bit more parallel with the hairline. She was a goat that didn't have any problems, so it's not drastic to do that, but just so that you know, we could have gone a little bit farther on the heel without hurting the goat at all. So indicators for how much to take off: as soon as you start to see pink, stop. That means that you're getting close to the blood vessels. You won't over trim without seeing that pink. So the pink is your indicator to stop trimming. Blood is your indicator to definitely stop trimming. And then we want to, wherever we hit that first pink spot, that first flesh spot, make it parallel to the hairline from there. So now we're going to watch a video of the same goat, and we're going to trim the front.
So now I'll show you front hoof. It's basically the same thing. We're just going to pick it up a little bit differently because of where the knee joint is. And then because I am doing this by myself without a stand, I just have to be careful with where I'm putting my body weight against her as a way to kind of stabilize her. So what I'll actually do is I'll turn around because of how she's set up, and I'm going to do the same thing. Rub my hand down her leg and bend it like this. And you'll see that this hoof looks very similar. So we've got the outer edges kind of overgrown. This heel has grown a little bit over the season, so we'll work on trimming it same way. So I'm going to do small snips on the outer edges. You can see right here, so this is why we hoof trim. This area, there is some debris that's starting to get down in that hoof in between the outer edge and the inner edge of the hoof. If we weren't trimming, that would be left in there, and it could turn into an infection, an ulcer, or just make her feet sore over time. So once I've got kind of my outer edges clipped down to where I want them, I'm going to do that blunt cut at the front, cut down some of the middle, and then I'll go to work on the heel. So same thing, small snips at a time. We're going to try to get the heel down until we see some flesh color, and then that's when we're going to stop. If we get to a spot where we can't quite get a grip on some to trim, you can go back up. Oh. So you saw on that one, I probably grabbed too big of a slice, and it was getting to a spot where it's going to hurt her. That's why she picked her foot up out of the way. So that gives me a clue that I might be getting close there. So I'm going to be careful there. Goats will tell you when you're getting too close. Okay, I'm going to keep trimming this one down just a little bit. And same thing as on the back ones. If the center of the hoof is a little bit humped up from your outer edges, that's okay. It'll wear down over time. And you can see right here, right on the inside of this hoof, we're just getting to some blood vessels. So I'm going to stop up in this area. And I think we'll call that good enough. So same thing on the other side, just going to go a little bit quicker. You can see here, she's just got some woody perennial debris, so we can pick that out so we can see what we're doing. Gonna trim off these outer edges. And yes, you should absolutely be wearing protective gloves for this so you don't snip your finger off. Do as I say, not as I do. And we're gonna take that blunt cut off the front. Keep working our way down. And we'll call that just about good enough. So the biggest thing that we're trying to do is to keep those outer edges pinned down. They'll wear down this middle part of the heel as they walk on it, but what happens over time is these outer edges grow over the middle of the hoof, and then this just creates a space that gets infected and rot and really sore for them. So we just want to keep these outer edges trimmed down. We can check in between our toes. Everything looks okay on this one. Dew claws look okay. Skin looks okay. And if you look at her standing on it now, you can see it's a lot flatter, trimmed up nicely. All right.
Okay, so that's how you trim goat feet. It definitely takes a lot more trial and error than that video. But it gives you the general idea of what you're going to be looking for and how you can approach it. There was a question about hoof trimming if you have hoof rot, and what's my opinion about not trimming if you have hoof rot. I think that it's always really good to hoof trim if you do have hoof rot, or if you don't. I think it's a good practice either way. You should definitely though refer to your vet if they recommend doing something else. So if I have a goat that I suspect might have hoof rot or hoof scald or beginning of an issue, the first thing that I do is trim. The theory behind not trimming, I haven't ever found anything substantiated to support that. So I'm hesitant to say like, well, this is why I think people might not be trimming. But most of the time we do recommend trimming the hoof down and soaking it in a copper zinc sulfate solution to help treat the hoof rot. In severe cases, your vet might recommend doing an antibiotic as well to treat that. The best way to prevent hoof rot is by trimming the hoof and keeping the hoof dry and clean and healthy. So trimming is going to make sure that we've got healthy tissue there that won't be affected as badly by hoof rot bacteria. And if you do end up with hoof rot or hoof scald, trimming the hoof will encourage healthy growth of the bacteria, will limit spaces that the bacteria can get in and keep eating at. It'll also help to prevent the infection getting from wherever it starts out into the inner wall of the hoof, where it can cause some like super severe issues. Hoof rot can get bad enough that it essentially blows apart this outer wall of the hoof. And we want to avoid that happening. And we can do that by making sure that we're trimming the feet on a regular schedule. So I'm not sure where specifically the theory behind not trimming comes from. I have always been told, have always read, and are definitely recommend trimming them on a regular schedule. And if you do suspect hoof rot, trim them anyway. The only other comment that I'll make is that if you do have an animal with hoof rot or hoof issues, trim them last, right? So that then you're not potentially spreading any of that bacteria to other animals. And it's always good practice to disinfect your trimmers between animals. Okay. So now we're going to talk about what do you do when things go wrong. If you are trimming feet and trimming hooves and one of the hooves starts to bleed, don't panic. It happens. Blood vessels are really close to the nail bed, particularly if you have some hooves that haven't been trimmed in a while. The blood vessels can grow longer and be closer to the surface. Apply pressure. If it's really severe, you can use a blood clotting powder or cornstarch. If you haven't given a tetanus booster, you might want to do that if they're out in the field, but mostly don't panic, just monitor it. If you are trimming feet and you notice some rot in tissue, and you'll notice it because it smells absolutely disgusting. It's soft, it's crumbly, it's just disgusting. You're going to know if you have hoof that's got some rotten material, whether it's hoof rot or caused by something else. What you need to do is clean your tools with rubbing alcohol or some other type of sanitizing solution, and then clean the tissue. You can use hydrogen peroxide or zinc sulfate solution. Clean that out with the solution, trim out around it as far down as you can, trim out the infected tissue as much as you can, and then monitor it. If it's really, really bad, you're going to want to reach out to your vet, possibly give them an antibiotic, possibly wrap it with some type of antibiotic solution. But for the most part, if you find rotten tissue, it's because the hooves haven't been trimmed on a regular schedule. The hooves have gotten overgrown. It's created an area where tissue can rot away, where bacteria can get into it. And you need to clean it out immediately and sanitize that hoof and just keep an eye on it. If you start to hoof trim and this outer wall is too hard to cut through, so your tools aren't working, you'll remember in our first video, soak it in zinc sulfate and that will soften up that outer wall for you. Or not zinc salt, I'm so sorry. Soak it in Epsom salts and hot water. So just like if you were to have like a foot bath, right? Same idea. It's going to soften up that outer wall. Anytime that I've had like an older goat that has a harder outer wall, just soaking it has done the trick, and I'm able to use my trimmers to get that hoof trimmed. If you go out there and the hooves are really overgrown, or you have a new animal and the hooves are really overgrown, don't try to do too much all at once. So if you've got an animal that the hooves are extremely overgrown, the outer wall has started to grow on the bottom, trim a little bit at a time over several days. Don't try to go too far at once. It'll be too much of a shock for the animal. You'll see them walking out there trying to remember how to walk on feet that aren't trimmed. The blood vessels are going to be very long. It's going to be a long process, and that's okay. So just take your time, monitor for any issues, and trim frequently. Other hoof care issues, foot scald, foot rot, which we've continually talked about. This is contagious. It's caused by soil bacteria, but it can also spread from goat to goat. If goats are out in muddy fields, if you brought in a new goat that was infected with hoof rot, if they are in unclean bedded pack situation, that can all spread hoof rot. The best thing you can do is to have frequent trimming. In mild cases of hoof scald, you can actually treat with trimming. So sometimes just trimming is exactly what that animal needed. The best thing you can do though is just try to prevent it as much as you can with not keeping animals clean and dry, not bringing in outside animals, and making sure that you have regular trimmings. We have a quick video of a very, very early hoof scald. So it hasn't made it to hoof rot yet. But it's of the goat that was limping. So Amy and I were out here. We regularly trim hooves on our farm, so we're able to catch cases like this early on. We were out there recording videos, saw that this goat was limping, and found just the first stage of hoof scald.
We noticed that this goat has been limping on her left front foot. We have no idea what's going on with it. We're going to take a look at it. Usually we want to make sure that we're looking at our goats every day, so that when we notice that they might be limping or something might be up, we can take a look at it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spin her around. And it's on her front leg. Run my hand down, pick her foot up, and we'll take a look. So the first thing I like to check is just to make sure that these outer parts are overgrown. Sometimes if they get overgrown, they can get just infection or something stuck inside. These haven't overgrown. You can see where they're just starting to. So this is the time that I would start trimming them. Next thing I look for is just any visible injury to the hoof. Sometimes they can get a puncture from a piece of wire. Rock can get stuck. That can cause a limp. I'm not seeing anything at first glance either. So the next thing that I look for is in the skin, in between the toes. Sometimes that can get not full hoof rot, but hoof scald is what they call it. And it's kind of like probably close to athlete's foot if you wanted to think about something like that. So it's wet, moist, bacteria can grow in here, and it can cause an infection in the skin. So I'm going to very carefully hooves apart. And if you can see that, you can see that her hooves are a little red in between the two hooves. So this would be the very, very beginnings of hoof scald. And if you look at the back, which is even, you can see that they're white, moist, and kind of have like a little bit of a pussy look, even though it's not pussy, but that's the. So it does look like there's some sore in between those two hooves. Again, that's just the beginnings of hoof scald. So the way that we'll treat this is we'll trim it down. We will, I usually do an Epsom soak that we'll talk about later. Give her some type of something with it, and keep an eye on that hoof moving forward. Make sure we're keeping it trimmed down.
Okay, so that's an example of early hoof scald. Hoof scald turns into hoof rot if you don't catch it and treat it. It really does look like athlete's foot. So if you've ever gotten athlete's foot before, and it's like that pale tissue that's like moist and a little bit sticky and uncomfortable, that's what early hoof scald will look like, right in between their hoof, where the hoof meets the skin. That animal was treated just by trimming the feet and giving them a zinc sulfate rinse, and she was back to normal within a couple of days. So just some quick attention can go a long way to prevent it from getting worse. As I mentioned before, if you're overfeeding animals, you can be at risk for laminitis or founder. This causes swelling of the internal part of the hoof, and it can create really sore feet. So this is primarily caused by changes in the diet, and you'll see it by overgrown feet. Animals will have swelling in their feet, and they're just not going to be as thrifty as normal. And then we can also experience these abscesses. These are pockets of infection. Typically, they're caused by some type of trauma to the hoof. So the goat stepped on a nail, stepped on a sharp branch, then that got infected. They will either show up as an external abscess, so you'll pick up the hoof and you'll see it right away. Or the more gross ones are when you start to see the goat limping, you pick up their hoof, you're trimming along, everything's fine, and then you hit the abscess and pus spurts out. Ask me how I know. It's absolutely disgusting. So what you do in that situation, you trim that hoof down and give them some antibiotics. Goats are prey animals, so they are going to hide any issues as much as they possibly can. So you can have goats that end up with some type of lesion or abscesses, and you don't know about it until you go to trim feet, which again is why it's important to trim feet on a regular basis. And then we added this in here. So if you remember last night, we were talking about the goat that had the like once in a lifetime hoof problem. This is called a granuloma. It's an overgrowth of tissue. It can be caused by an injury early in age, or it could just be something that they're born with or something that they develop over time. In this case, we worked with our vet, and what we did with this hoof is we actually let this outer wall overgrow intentionally. It covered that area, provided protection for the goat, and allowed the scar tissue to build up to protect that tissue overgrowth. And now she doesn't have any hoof issues. And then last thing that we'll talk about when it comes to hoof trimming is just keeping track of records. So you should track who you trimmed, when you trimmed them, and if you found any issues while you were trimming them, and if you ended up having to treat anything. If you keep track of these records over time, you're going to recognize patterns. Is there a line of animals that tend to have more hoof problems than others? Do you notice that after a rainstorm, you've got some early stages of hoof scald? Do you notice that there's one pasture where animals seem to pick up more hoof issues than other ones? So just keeping track of who you're trimming, when you're trimming, and anything that you found while you were trimming them. All right, and I think that's everything for tonight that we have. We do appreciate your flexibility because we did go over time. Amy and I are going to hang out here for a little bit and take any questions if you have them. While you're thinking about questions, here's a couple of videos recently. So fun story, we had a set of triplets born this year. My kids named them Steve. They're all three of them. Every single one is Steve. We have Big Steve, Little Steve, and Middle Steve. They were bottle babies because they weren't doing well. Mom wasn't doing well. So now we have these triplets that act like dogs. This first video is the bottle babies trying to eat our 2-year-old.
Too many goats and
So bottle babies are terrible. Anybody who's raised bottle babies know how bad they are, but they're lovable and they're cute, so it's okay.
And they're also, I just want to like interject, I've met the Steves and they are just as obnoxious like 2 months later.
They're terrible.
They're
terrible.
large and they want to love on you.
So this is a more recent video of the Steves. We also have a lot of dogs, and this is our doorbell camera. So the other night I was coming back from our barn into our house, and I thought that it was the dogs running behind me. And it wasn't until I got into my house and heard like click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, that I realized it was the dang goats following me from the barn into our house. So they do not believe in fences. They do not believe in barriers to their people. They are dogs at this point, and we're never going to be able to get rid of them. So this is the goats following me, and I didn't notice. I thought it was the dogs behind me, and look at them. They're like, we're going inside. The one fat one, the big Steve, he actually made it into the dog food bin that we have, and he was just munching on dog food. So, yeah, just some advice from your friendly local extension agent. I think I share most of these stories that to make you guys know, or just to let you guys know that like we're presenting you with best case scenario information, research-based information, but what happens in real life happens in real life, and you just have to do what you can.
Yep.
So any questions, comments, or additions to anything about herd health or hoof issues?
And as you're thinking about that, I am going to throw up the final poll, which is a learning check. So we want to know what you learned today. If you learned a lot, a little, not a whole lot. And if you want to learn more about goats, and if so, which topics you'd like to learn more about. This will be kept anonymous. I will not share this with you. This is for our edification so that we know what information to present to you moving forward. So thank you for the opportunity to present to you. Thank you for all your wonderful questions.
Do you want to give a preview of next week?
So Monday, same time, same place, and Tuesday, same time, same place. We are going to meet again to talk about our last two goat topics. So on Monday, we're going to be talking about pasture and parasite health. Pasture management is one of those #1 things that we can do as herd managers to ensure the health and well-being of our animals. We're going to talk through the FMACHA training. We're going to talk through different parasites that you can expect on pasture and how to manage pastures the best way for goats. And then on Tuesday, we have baby mama drama, which is essentially kidding and reproduction. We'll talk through reproductive capacities, different breeding cycles, and then we'll get into kidding kits and the kidding process. So those will, they also include some fun videos. So we're looking forward to seeing you there.
Great. All right, I'll turn off the recording now.
That sounds good.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. So